Welcome back to our channel and remember to subscribe. I'm really glad you're here with us today because we need to talk about something that has been making major waves in the British press lately. It turns out that veteran royal commentator Richard Eden is apparently losing sleep over the future of the royal family, and honestly, his latest freakout is kind of fascinating to dissect. He's been sounding the alarm about what he sees as the impending downfall of the monarchy, and his biggest point of panic right now revolves around the fate of Buckingham Palace itself. According to Eden, who has been talking to various palace insiders, there is this growing fear that the iconic palace is going to lose its status as the actual living, breathing home of the sovereign. Instead, he reports that it might just be relegated to a sort of glorified corporate office, or what he's calling Monarchy HQ, used strictly for official events, receptions, and investitures, while King Charles and Queen Camilla continue to live elsewhere. Now, when you stop and think about it, the whole situation is pretty wild, especially when you look at the financial side of things. We are talking about a massive taxpayer-funded refurbishment project that is costing a staggering £370 million. Let that number sink in for a second. £370 million of public money is being spent to completely overhaul and modernize this gigantic historic building. And yet, after all that cash has been poured into it, the king and queen might not even really live there full time. It's no wonder people are scratching their heads, but for someone like Eden, this isn't just a logistical change. It is an existential crisis for the British crown. You can really feel the desperation in how these royal traditionalists are reacting to the whole thing. It's like they genuinely believe that if the king doesn't sleep under that specific roof, the entire institution is just going to crumble into dust. It's almost absurd to watch how terrified they are of the royal family's potential fall from grace. But let's be real for a minute. The truth that people like Richard Eden just refuse to see is that the institution of the monarchy is increasingly losing its relevance in the modern world. To a huge portion of the population, especially younger generations, the idea of a hereditary head of state seems totally outdated, like a relic from a completely different era. But royalists like Eden just cannot let go. They are so desperate to protect the institution at all costs that they completely blind themselves to its obvious downfalls, refusing to objectively judge its flaws or acknowledge why so many people are turning away from it. Instead of questioning why hundreds of millions of pounds are being spent on a palace that might just end up being an empty museum and a backdrop for photos, they direct all their energy into fearing change. They panic over the symbolism of an empty palace while totally ignoring the much bigger systemic issues that are actually making the monarchy look incredibly out of touch today. It's this blind loyalty that makes the whole commentary surrounding the royals so dramatic. And today we're going to dive deep into why this Buckingham Palace drama is triggering such a massive existential meltdown for the royal establishment, and what it really says about the future of the crown. To really understand why Richard Eden is having such a massive meltdown over this, we have to look at what Buckingham Palace actually represents to people who worship the tradition of the crown. For centuries, that building hasn't just been an office building, it has been the literal heart of the British Empire and the ultimate symbol of royal authority. When people look at that famous balcony, they aren't just looking at stone and mortar, they are looking at the visual definition of the British state. So when insiders start whispering to journalists like Eden that the palace might just become a place where the king clocks in for work at 9 and leaves at 5, it completely shatters the illusion. It strips away the magic and the romance that the monarchy relies on to justify its existence. If the king is just commuting to the palace like any other corporate CEO going to a headquarters in central London, then the whole mystique of the royal family starts to evaporate. Eden is looking at this and seeing the beginning of the end. He genuinely fears that once he turned the palace into Monarchy HQ, you're admitting that the royals are just public servants in fancy clothes, rather than these grand historical figures who are fundamentally different from the rest of us. But honestly, can we just laugh at the sheer absurdity of the panic for a second? The idea that the monarchy is going to fall apart just because Charles prefers the cozy vibes of Clarence House over the cavernous, drafty halls of Buckingham Palace is kind of hilarious. I mean, think about it. But it shows how completely disconnected these royalists are from normal human reality. They're so invested in the theatrical production of the monarchy that they view a totally practical living arrangement as a sign of a collapsing civilization. They are desperately trying to protect the version of the royal family that simply doesn't exist anymore, and their refusal to face reality is honestly getting a little embarrassing to watch. And let's talk about that price tag again, because £370 million is not pocket change. In a world where normal people are struggling with the cost of living, paying astronomical bills and trying to make ends meet, seeing that amount of public money spent on a building that the king might not even live in is a pretty tough pill to swallow. This is where the blind spot of royalists like Eden becomes so incredibly glaring. They're so busy worrying about the symbolic dignity of the crown that they completely fail to see how terrible this looks to the average taxpayer. They don't stop to judge the downfall of an institution that demands hundreds of millions of pounds for a home renovation while its citizens are facing economic hardships. Instead of demanding accountability or wondering if maybe that money could have been used better elsewhere, they're just crying about the fact that the palace won't have that traditional lived-in feel. It's this exact lack of self-awareness and refusal to criticize the monarchy's flaws that is actually driving its decline. By blindly defending every aspect of the institution and panicking over trivial things like room usage, they're completely missing the real reason why the monarchy is losing its relevance. When you look at the bigger picture, this whole Buckingham Palace controversy is just a symptom of a much larger shift that is happening right now. People like Eden are realizing that a slimmed-down monarchy is a less impressive monarchy. It's a monarchy that looks less like a grand historical tradition and more like a government department. And that terrifies them because a government department can be audited, it can be questioned, and it can ultimately be downsized or abolished if it's no longer serving a purpose. That is the real future that Richard Eden fears. He fears a world where the British public looks at the royal family and says, "Why are we paying for this?" By turning Buckingham Palace into Monarchy HQ, the royals are accidentally accelerating that exact conversation, exposing the fact that the institution is struggling to find its place in the modern world. It's honestly fascinating to watch this play out because it shows a complete generational divide in how we view power and tradition. For the older generation of royalists, the monarchy is this sacred, unquestionable thing that must be preserved exactly as it was in the days of Queen Victoria or Queen Elizabeth II.
They see any change, even something as minor as where the king sleeps, as a dangerous threat to the stability of the nation. But for the rest of the world, we're looking at this and thinking, who cares where he lives as long as the public isn't being ripped off? The relevance of the monarchy doesn't depend on Buckingham Palace being a home. It depends on whether the institution can offer anything of real value to a modern democratic society. And right now, the answer to that question is becoming harder and harder for royalists to find, which is exactly why they're sounding so desperate. They know the tide is turning, and no amount of expensive palace renovations can hide the fact that the world is moving on without them. So, as we watch this drama continue to unfold in the headlines, it is worth remembering that the fear we are seeing from commentators like Richard Eden isn't really about Buckingham Palace at all. It is about a deep, underlying anxiety that the monarchy's days of unquestioned privilege and relevance are coming to an end. They are clinging to the past because they are terrified of a future where the royal family is judged not by its ancient titles and grand palaces, but by its actual value and fairness to the people it claims to represent. It's going to be incredibly interesting to see how the public reacts as the refurbishment nears completion and the true purpose of the palace becomes clear. Will it remain the ultimate symbol of royal power, or will it just become a very expensive monument to an institution that forgot how to change with the times? Only time will tell, but one thing is for sure, the panic from the royalists is far from over. It is honestly fascinating to watch this play out because it shows a complete generational divide in how we view power and tradition. For the older generation of royalists, the monarchy is this sacred, unquestionable thing that must be preserved exactly as it was in the days of Queen Victoria or Queen Elizabeth II. They see any change, even something as minor as where the king sleeps, as a dangerous threat to the stability of the nation. But for the rest of the world, we're looking at this and thinking, who cares where he lives as long as the public isn't being ripped off? The relevance of the monarchy doesn't depend on Buckingham Palace being a home. It depends on whether the institution can offer anything of real value to a modern democratic society. And right now, the answer to that question is becoming harder and harder for royalists to find, which is exactly why they're sounding so desperate. They know the tide is turning, and no amount of expensive palace renovations can hide the fact that the world is moving on without them. But let's pause for a second and look at how this plays out in the real world. Think about the sheer logistical comedy of the situation. You have this massive, echoing fortress with hundreds of rooms, and the people running the show are treating it like a hot potato. No one actually wants to live there because it's basically a drafty museum, but they've already spent hundreds of millions of public pounds fixing the plumbing and updating the wiring. Imagine explaining that to someone who can't get their local roads paved or their community center funded. It is a completely surreal disconnect. Richard Eden and his fellow commentators look at this and see a a tragedy of lost majesty, but for the average person watching from the outside, it feels like a badly managed corporate real estate portfolio. The obsession with keeping up appearances while completely missing the point of public perception is exactly what makes the modern monarchy look so incredibly out of touch. And that brings us to the core issue of why these royal defenders are so completely terrified. They aren't just afraid of a building being empty, they're afraid of the curtain being pulled back. If Buckingham Palace becomes nothing more than a backdrop for occasional photo ops and official handshakes, the public starts to realize that the entire thing is just a grand, expensive performance. The magic disappears, and when the magic disappears, you're just left looking at a group of very wealthy people who inherited an enormous amount of influence in real estate for no particular reason. That realization is the ultimate nightmare for traditionalists. They need the public to believe in the fairy tale, because without the fairy tale, the justification for the whole system just evaporates. So they fight tooth and nail over every little detail, from who gets which apartment to how many nights a week the king spends in London, hoping that if they hold onto the symbols tightly enough, nobody will notice that the world around them has completely changed. When you step back and look at where all of this is leading, it becomes painfully clear that we are witnessing the final desperate gasp of an outdated era. The absolute panic coming from traditionalists like Richard Eden isn't just about a change of address, it is the ultimate realization that the world has fundamentally moved on. For centuries, the royal family maintained its grip on the public imagination by wrapping itself in a cloak of untouchable mystique and grand tradition, but you can only rely on the past for so long before the present catches up with you. By turning Buckingham Palace into a sterile corporate headquarters, a literal monarchy HQ, the institution is giving up the ghost. They are inadvertently admitting that the grand fairy tale is over, and that they are now just a highly pampered branch of the civil service. No matter how much money is thrown at those palace walls, you cannot buy back the automatic, unquestioned reverence of a population that is increasingly looking at heritable privilege with nothing but skepticism and exhaustion. The tragic comedy of the whole situation is that royalists are completely blind to their own hypocrisy. They will lecture the public about the profound national importance of spending £370 million on a palace refurbishment, but the moment anyone asks for accountability or points out that the king doesn't even want to live there, they accuse the critics of trying to destroy British culture. It is honestly hilarious how fragile their worldview is. They are so consumed by the fear of the royal family's fall that they are entirely incapable of stepping back and judging its actual downfalls. They cannot see that the real threat to the monarchy isn't the change in living arrangements. It is their own refusal to acknowledge that a modern, fair society doesn't need a tiny family of inherited billionaires to symbolize its national identity. The desperate defense of these empty symbols only highlights how completely empty the institution itself has become, leaving it utterly irrelevant to the lives of everyday people. So, as this massive, incredibly expensive project wraps up and the truth of the palace's future becomes undeniable, the royal family is going to find itself facing an entirely new kind of crisis. They will be sitting in a perfectly renovated multi-million-pound corporate office, looking out at a public that has largely tuned out. The old tricks of waving from the balcony and relying on historical romance just aren't going to work anymore on a generation that values fairness, equality, and real utility over ancient titles and expensive real estate. Commentators like Richard Eden can continue to sound the alarm and cry over the loss of the good old days all they want, but they cannot stop the inevitable march of progress. The monarchy is shrinking, it is losing its grip, and no amount of public relations spin or high-price renovations can save an institution whose time has simply run out. It is going to be truly fascinating to see how long they can keep up the charade before the rest of the world completely walks away. Thank you for watching, and remember to subscribe.